I couldn't help but notice that you've clicked on and are presently listening to an episode of the Paranormal Patio podcast. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your support. And if you want to continue to support us, the best thing you can do is share our episodes on social media. That's right. You can tag us in everything. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also find us on paranormalpatio.com, where you'll find articles, links to information from our past guests, as well as, every episode as it comes out. Also, head on over to Patreon. Patreon.com/BeyondThePatio. You can get a monthly live stream, at least one. Sometimes we do more. Exclusive bonus content, early access to all of our episodes. And starting with Season 3, I've got to move Season 1 to the archives. So they'll be on Patreon as well, and you can listen to them there. Thanks again for your support. And hey, let's get into the episode. What kind of weird thing are we talking about today? On this episode of Paranormal Patio, we're going to dig into the story of Valiant Thor. Yes, that's right. Valiant Thor, the Venusian, who came to the United States to work with the government back in the 1950s, allegedly. We're going to get to the bottom of that. Also, we're going to talk about Frank E. Stranges. That is Reverend Dr. Frank E. Stranges. And it's an interesting tale. And how that relates to Valiant Thor will all be discussed. Also, my good friend Matthew is here. And that's who we're going to be talking with. And he's going to explain all this stuff. But he's going to dig a little bit into Admiral Byrd, who had the Antarctic expedition to try to find the entrance to the Hollow Earth. And also just some more of how this whole story is connected to each part. And it's a really fascinating discussion. Looking forward to hearing your comments on social media, so hit us up. I won't keep you waiting any longer. Here's Matthew Byrd.
You're listening to the Paranormal Patio Podcast.
Welcome back to Paranormal Patio. As always, I'm Jason. And you know what? I've got a special guest tonight. My good friend, Matthew Byrd, is here. Matthew, welcome to the Paranormal Patio.
It's good to be here, Jason.
It's great to have you here, man. I'm excited because I know how you operate and how historically factual your research typically is. And whenever I asked you to come on, we were both excited. And I know that this conversation is going to be full of things that I've never heard before. And that's always a plus.
I'm hoping so as well.
There's no doubt in my mind. Because every time, because we're in a lot of the same circles, right?
Right.
We show up in live stream chats and everything, and you're always over. Actually, yeah, you're my Patreon. One of my earlier Patreon members on live streams and things. There's always, if there's a question that comes up, we just kind of sit and wait for you to give us the answer because it's kind of your thing. It's what you do.
I Google very well.
No, the secret has been exposed.
Yeah, afraid so. Owned by Google.
Oh, that's okay, because you still are right there with the info when we need it. So, before we get into the conversation, I'll just have you kind of give a little bit of background information on yourself, who you are, what you do, and that way everybody here, knows what I know.
Absolutely. My name is Matthew Byrd. I am a folklorist. I consider myself a genealogist. I used to consider myself an occultist, but a friend of mine told me the other day that they really liked the term mountain mystic, and so I'm kind of going with that now. But I'm also a seventh generation child of the free and independent state of Scott, which is a small county in East Tennessee. My passions are storytelling. I'm really big into grave preservation and passing on knowledge from those who have moved on beyond the clearing.
I really dig mountain mystic, man. That's very suiting
right?
to you. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I've ever come across that, exact terminology before, but I totally dig it.
I need to copyright it, I think, at this point.
Yeah, you should get on that. You could license it out.
The way that they used to do it when I was a kid was my family would write gospel songs, and what they would do to get the copyright, they would handwrite the lyrics and such, and they would mail it to themselves and leave it in the envelope. It's got the date and stamp. It's got the postmark. So if ever anything comes up legal-wise, they can just open that envelope and go, hey, this is when I wrote it, and here's the proof.
Yeah, I've heard of that actually a lot. I've always known it as the poor man's copyright law, and I don't know if it'll hold up in a court, but it's worth a shot.
Around here, that's pretty much all we got.
Yeah, I can relate 100%. So, Matthew, you're here finally in the patio after all of this time. What did you bring to my studio to talk about tonight?
So here is what we're going to be talking primarily about. This started as just one of those things that I was watching the latest season of American Horror Story, and in the second half of the season, it was all about aliens and such. The character of Valiant Thor came up, and I know that you have at least one book that proudly displays Valiant's name on it.
Yes.
And what was interesting about it, I forget what I was searching. A term had come up, but what was crazy about it was the name Dr. Harley Byrd came up, which is my last name as well. It was in reference to him being the nephew of Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd Jr., who turns out to be my relation as well. Admiral Byrd was my fourth cousin, 4 times removed. Like I said, I'm really big in genealogy and family trees, and that was something I discovered a couple of years ago, and I was really excited about that because my grandma used to talk about Admiral Byrd's exploits and such, and I know you have the interest in some of his explorations and such with your research. So it was really interesting that Harley was writing an introduction to the book Stranger at the Pentagon, which was by the Reverend Dr. Frank E. Stranges, and that's kind of where this rabbit hole began.
How awesome would it be to be of the family Stranges?
Well, you have to realize that he was the first Dr. Stranges.
Which is just awesome.
So I don't know if Marvel owes him some money or how that works out, but
probably not. But that's how cool of a name is that, Dr. Stranges.
Oh, yeah. The Reverend Dr. Stranges.
I dig it, man. You brought up the Admiral Byrd stuff, and we covered that way back in season 1 briefly. I mean, it was mentioned. Is that on your list of topics that you'd like to cover tonight?
Tonight, we might circle back around there. We're going to kind of skirt around Operation High Jump and the Hollow Earth stuff. That would take, I think, a whole nother hour to go through.
Oh, yeah, probably. This Dr. Stranges. What can you tell me about Dr. Stranges?
Dr. Stranges, he is an interesting fellow. One of the first things that I would discover about him, kind of my introduction to this research, was the earliest newspaper article I had found on him would come from a story from the Minneapolis Star from January of 1952. Now, remember the early 50s in this conversation, because it's going to come up a lot, 51, 52 through about 54. Dr. Stranges was abducted at gunpoint and forced to drive 75 miles. Nothing was stolen, as reportedly the gunman asked for his wallet. The Reverend Doctor gave it to him. He saw that he was a minister and only had $2 on his person, so he returned the wallet and just had the doctor drive him around, basically. and he went to about 3 points around Wisconsin, and at one point, he just jumped out of the car. He just jumps out. And so the Reverend Doctor goes and reports this to the police, it says. And it has a picture of him, tales of kidnapping, and it's just so surreal that this is, the first thing you really find in research on him. At that point, the pastor of the Spring Lake Park Assembly of God Church now under construction.
Do you know what he was a doctor of?
We're going to get into that.
Awesome. Okay. I'm with you.
But put a little pin in that. We're going to get to that point. Not to take over the interview, Jason, tell me what you know of Valiant Thor.
Very little, admittedly. However, I know that allegedly a Venusian, right, that was working with the U.S. government back in the 50s to, I don't remember if it was to kind of drive us to a more peaceful resolution with world government or if it was to totally cripple the opposing forces. I don't remember exactly. I know very little.
You're exactly on the nose with it.
Perfect. So you mentioned earlier the book I have that has his name on it, and I think we talked about this in one of my live streams on Patreon, but the book is Valiant Thor's Guide to the Inner Earth, and it has nothing to do with Valiant Thor whatsoever.
That was one of my big things about wanting to know about it, because I believe you said that New Saucerian was the publisher of it.
Correct.
That's run by Andrew Colvin of West Virginia, and he had basically taken over the Saucerian Press that was run in his garage by Gray Barker.
Right. In Illinois.
There was a lot of Valiant Thor stuff that came out during Barker's time as well.
Sure.
From what I've heard about it, it almost, as any listener of your show knows, Gray Barker was a bit of a trickster. He considered himself just reporting on the kookiness of what was going on in the UFO world, and he really didn't believe what he was writing, but it was making him money, so he was good with it. I don't know. On the New Saucerian thing, it may just be a continuation of the Valiant Thor rib, but an interesting point of the book that you were talking about with yours is there was also a Valiant Thor book that was called Outliving Tomorrow. What's interesting about that book is it was originally wrote back in I believe 1939 by a gentleman who was involved with the Golden Dawn Press and wrote the book under the name of Freighter 8. That would later be kind of rewritten and some of the names changed, and suddenly Mr. Thor's name is put on it, and it becomes part of his helpful guides to the universe.
That's interesting. So it was originally written not about Valiant Thor.
Correct. Back in the 30s, it was completely different. And I think from what I've seen on most of these Valiant Thor things, it looks like maybe out-of-date books that are, little known, and they're kind of changed around a little bit to skirt the copyright. But I mean, it's the exact same title. It has some of the exact same themes. It was just changed around a little bit, and that seems a little bit of the modus operandi of Doctor Strange's as well. I
have the Guide to the Inner Earth here in front of me, and since we're talking about this, Valiant Thor kind of being used as a pseudonym or a surname, right? In the epilogue written by Gray Barker in 1984, the first paragraph reads as such, well, at least the first couple of sentences. In the "It Can Now Be Told" department, we may now reveal that Bruce Walton was none other than the enlightened Venusian sage, Commander Valiant Thor, using a pseudonymous surname derived from Valiant. Unfortunately, this sleight of hand was necessary due to heightened Cold War tensions and various threats that had been made against Thor and his family, who were working hard to stop the nuclear arms race between the U.S. and the USSR. Since the underground areas around Mount Shasta, Mount Adams, and Mount Rainier are known to have stable tunnels and chambers, these became relatively safe parking spots for Thor's spacecraft, Victor 1.
Yes. Good old Victor 1. Yeah. So, a little background on it, and this is coming from Dr. Hurley, Andrew Byrd's introduction to Stranger of the Pentagon. Basically, in mid-March of 1957, and I should point out that in this introduction, he is introduced as someone who was working on Project Blue Book at the time, which, if you're the nephew of Admiral Byrd, who was a great American hero, you were in the Navy as well. You had the contacts. You were part of Project Blue Book. You have the credentials to vouch for Dr. Strange's account of how he got involved with the Valiant Thor case. In this particular passage, he was talking about that Project Blue Book had received an urgent message from the Alexandria Police Department. The message indicated that 2 of their on-duty police officers had picked up an alien who had landed some 14 miles south of Pentagon Boulevard, and the occupant was transported to the Pentagon to meet with the Undersecretary of Defense and was then shuttled underground to meet with President Eisenhower and Vice President Richard Nixon. The meeting lasted for nearly an hour, and then the alien visitor was put on VIP status, was shuttled back to the Pentagon, where he spent the night in the Army reception office on the first floor, and the alien's name was Valiant Thor.
It's really interesting that they make a blatant point of saying that he was shuttled underground, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you know me, right? This whole Hollow Earth and underground military bases and underground possibly alien bases, all this stuff was sort of it's exactly what we started the show on. That was our very first episode, A War Beneath Our Feet. But it definitely, it reaches out. It has these underground tendrils into the Hollow Earth theory. Then Valiant Thor comes up, and here he shows up at the Pentagon, and they shuttle him around underground. I love it.
Now, that's absolutely correct, because Eisenhower was also linked to alien contact before that. There's a popular theory that Eisenhower was on a golf vacation in Palm Springs back in 1954. After dinner that night, they said that he had made an unscheduled departure from the Smoking Tree Ranch, where he was staying. The next morning, he attended a church service in Los Angeles. Also that morning, his spokesman announced to the press that he had visited a dentist that previous night because he had chipped a tooth while eating a chicken wing at dinner. But the tale endorsed by no less than his great-granddaughter Laura Eisenhower tells of his trip to Edwards Air Force Base, where he met with 2 extraterrestrials with white hair, pale blue eyes, and colorless lips that spoke to him telepathically.
That's interesting. I've heard the broken tooth on the chicken wing story, actually, but I didn't know that's where this was going.
Now, as for Val, with his time in the Pentagon, you would also begin to see the introduction to his crew. Soon after his arrival, together with 3 members of his crew, he joined a convention in the backyard of the home of Mr. Howard Menger, who was in High Bridge, New Jersey. That was supposed to be in April 1957, but there's a couple of different stories of whether it was 1957 or 1958, which kind of blurs the lines even more. So they said a certain group of individuals who were interested in UFOs were meeting that day. Val and his crew members, Don, D-O-N-N, Jill, and Tanya had changed into the same type of clothing worn by their Earth friends. The meeting was very interesting, and these people were on the right track. He was dismayed to learn of the undignified manner in which these people were been treated by the press. This was, when you see a lot of the pictures of Valiant Thor, this is where it was coming from, this supposed meeting in the High Bridge area. Not
to just deter the conversation, but do we know what took place at this meeting between the nephew of Admiral Byrd and Frank Strange's?
So, I'm trying to remember exactly how they got involved together. And once you know their backgrounds, it kind of goes into play with what this all turned out to be. And you really have to look into the background of Strange's and the background of Byrd to understand all the the nuances of it. When I started looking at what became the introduction of the book, in 1993, Dr. Byrd was still being listed as the nephew of Admiral Byrd, and he was doing lectures about Hollow Earth. This was from the Santa Fe New Mexican in April of 93. It was talking about a 2-hour intensive one-on-one informative talk about his uncle's achievements and the reasons the flights to the inner worlds were repressed, slides and visuals included, Operation High Jump, culminating the 40-year intrepid polar examinations and the military suppressed discovery of the name of national security. These types of lectures that Dr. Byrd were doing was also the kind of lectures that Dr. Stranges was doing back in the late 50s and early 60s. He had started out just mixing his evangelism, but the longer it came, the more interested he became in UFOs, and it started becoming the same thing where he was doing lectures about what the government is suppressing and Valiant Thor. And I believe they kind of met up through that, to be honest. And I don't want to ruin the punchline of all this, but
okay, yeah.
Dr. Byrd, for lack of better terms, is not what he seems. He is not only not the nephew of Admiral Byrd. At one point in 95, he actually went on Coast to Coast, and there was a big total change of stories and stuff. He was now the grandson of Admiral Byrd, and he had carried the flag at the graveyard, and the wife of Admiral Byrd had went into his pocket when the coffin was still open at the graveside, which of course the coffin was closed. There's you can go on YouTube and look at actual footage of the funeral procession and see, the closed casket and the flag dripped over. But allegedly she went into his pocket and handed this envelope to Harley Byrd. He didn't know what it was at the time. He thought it might have been some money. But supposedly it was the secret lost diary of Admiral Byrd. Now that he was dead, it could be released. And when you see those online for sale on various online merchants that we will not name, that's supposedly the diary that was leaked by Dr. Byrd.
So, not to interject myself into your information here, but I have the book still in front of me, the Inner Guide book, and I looked up Byrd to see, assuming there would be, Admiral Richard Byrd in here, right? There is, in fact, a small section. Admiral Byrd mentions a flight to the land beyond the North Pole, or is this the missing diary of Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd? Forward by William Bernard, who I just bought a book from 1964 from.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, forward by William Bernard, Captain T.W.B. Schausch, International Society for a Complete Earth, Hollow Earth Society, Houston, Missouri. Also available from International Search Inner Earth Psionics Organization. Describes Byrd's alleged contact and encounter with the Ariani, a Hollow Earth civilization with whom he came in contact during his Arctic expedition. Yeah, this is an interesting take because I need to read this book from 1964 and see what he says about Admiral Byrd.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't find the actual episode from Art Bell that had Dr. Byrd on it, but there were plenty of long discussions of people who had just going over the information that was being given out, and he was pretty much trounced. When I did research on Dr. Byrd, you would expect him to have direct connections, especially now claiming to be the grandson, not, the nephew.
Right.
When you look him up in old newspapers, you have to actually go to Oklahoma, beginning with his early Navy career. And what's interesting about it, when you see the clippings, It does mention that he was a member of the Honor Guard detail, which would certainly place him at the location to have been part of Admiral Byrd's funeral. But the question remains, did he use his name familiarity as a stepping stone?
I would imagine. I mean, I feel like it's a no-brainer, right?
Right. And I actually asked a buddy of mine who was in the Navy as well, and I kind of showed him some of the clippings and see what he thought about it. He said that it had mentioned, features duty station of Honor Guard. But what was interesting about that is he pointed out that they had a specific weight and height requirement for application to that. So was it his name that got him that position, or was it just the fact that he was the right size to be in that particular section of the Navy?
Yeah. I know that you're really into the genealogy and things. Have you been able to discern, how he was actually related to Admiral Byrd?
I did. That was one of the fun parts about it. From a genealogical standpoint, Harley is the son of the late Everett Byrd, who was in turn the son of William Byrd, which makes him neither the nephew nor the grandson of Richard Evelyn Byrd Jr. We can trace Harley's paternal line of Byrd all the way back to Andrew Byrd, who was not directly connected to Richard E. Byrd or the Byrds of Westover, Virginia at all. I actually did some searches on various things, and I found a connection to Harley from my lineage, but it's far off. It's eighth cousins or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it's not directly related to the Byrds of Westover.
That's very interesting.
So in essence, we have a non-related or possibly a distant-related Byrd who may have capitalized on his last name to connect himself with the conspiracy theories of both Admiral Byrd's secret diary and to aid his friend Frank Strange's book on Valiant Thor by claiming to be part of Project Blue Book. And he may have worked in the office for Blue Book. It's not uncommon. But with so much of Blue Book open to the public now, it's strange that the Valiant Thor file mentioned in the introduction is seemingly non-existent.
Yeah.
If Harley used just enough truth to construct a story, if the very introduction is a false narrative made to legitimize the story, what does that say about the subject itself of Valiant Thor?
Yeah, I'm on board with that because, I don't know, there's a lot of people like you and I that are, at least familiar with Valiant Thor, but it's not something that takes up a lot of space on message boards and websites and podcasts, really. There's not a lot of concrete evidence. I've always only seen the one alleged photo, right? And it could just be a guy. So
the picture that everybody seems to throw out, there are a lot of people online who try to argue that the person in the actual picture is Frank Strange's himself. I don't think it's him from what I've seen of the Reverend Strange's and the picture of Valiant Thor. But what's interesting is nobody comes forward and say, oh, that was me. That was, such and such.
That is interesting.
And that goes back to, you kind of have to, when you look at Strange's, you have to kind of look at Howard Minger. He was a contactee that brought up the Venusians in the late 50s. And you also got to look at George Adamski, which if you look at him, I think a lot of the Venusian stuff started with him because in 52, he had reported that he had met and conversed with a visitor from Venus in a California desert.
Right.
And they were using hand gestures and telepathy as well. And the other thing that I see come up a lot in discussions is the 51 film, The Day the Earth Stood Still, which had a similar theme of, they come to Earth to try to teach us not to blow ourselves up. I don't know. It's with Dr. Strange's, he became involved with alien research and stuff when he was a student at the Eastern Bible College back in the 40s. His roommate would tell him a story of a UFO encounter he had. The doctor was interviewed by Adam Go Rightly, which I know you're familiar with.
Yeah.
And there's actually a YouTube video of the interview. It's a really good discussion, but it's made evident that there was an interest in his followers, that they had an interest in extraterrestrial life, and he was kind of bringing the word of the Bible, including a discussion of his meeting Valiant Thor in 59 and the interactions with Howard Menger, who also figured into the Valiant Thor legend, as I mentioned. It seems like to me that when you look at the change over of just his normal evangelism to being able to, sell pamphlets and booklets about his alien encounters and such, he not only was bringing people in, but he was also making money on it. And when you look at the book itself of Stranger at the Pentagon, it's very, very biblical. Valiant Thor talks a lot about Jesus. Even if you look at when he arrived, they say that he arrived on the 16th of March, which of course is 3:16, which translates to, John 3:16.
Or Austin 3:16.
Well, you know what Austin 3:16 just said.
I'm going to whoop your ass.
That's right. And that's the bottom line, because Stone Cold said so.
Oh, sorry. I had to do it. I didn't want to.
I love it. I love it. I can't lie. So when you talk about the Valiant Thor case and you see all the connections of a minister who ties a hunger for UFO stories and brings forth this mysterious being that, of course, knows and encourages the teachings of Jesus Christ, it all starts to fall into place.
Again, I'm going to jump in here because something really interesting just happened, okay?
Okay.
As you had mentioned, this guy being, he's a reverend. He's a believer. He is interjecting his faith and biblical context into these stories. I immediately thought of the book Beyond Lanulos by Tanya Derenberger, who is Woody Derenberger's daughter. Woody Derenberger, of course, having the interaction with Indrid Cold. And I remembered why I never finished the book. And it was because I got to a point where she was talking about Indrid's crewmate, Carl Ardo's kids. I think one of the crewmate's kids coming, or may have even been Indrid's kids, coming, playing with her and her brother, and that they had talked about how they always read the Bible on Lanulos. And I thought, this doesn't make any sense. Okay. The Bible is an earthly thing. Our interpretation, the stories of all these people biblically took place on Earth. There is no reason that this alleged Lanulos would have any knowledge of any of these things happening, nor would it be important to them. So I stopped reading the book. But as you said that, I reached back and I grabbed it off of my bookshelf and I opened it from the back like I always do. And the first picture that I came to at the end of this book is a picture of Valiant Thor. And it says, Valiant Thor, who may have presented himself as Indrid Cold to the Derenberger family, appeared at Howard Menger's UFO convention in Highbridge, New Jersey in 1957. Publisher Gray Barker worked with Thor to convince several contactees to approach authorities and publish books in an apparent attempt to influence public opinion on a variety of political issues.
There you go.
Wow.
See, working together in tandem. I love it.
Yes.
And even they bring up, with Menger, he had religious revelations to impart after his experiences as well. So, what's really interesting is, especially when the Freedom of Information Act came out, there was various groups online that were just, sending out FOIA requests. Nathan sends them out all the time.
Yeah.
With Pennyroyal. And they had a really, really nice file on Doctor Strange's. And it brought up a lot of good points when you're looking at his information. And you had asked earlier about what he was a doctor of and such.
Yeah.
And you'll notice that Dr. Harley is a doctor as well. It's interesting to note that Dr. Strange was also a member of what they called the NICAP, which was not to be confused with the organization that he would be the founder of, which was the National Investigations Committee on Unidentified Flying Objects, which was NICUFO. When the advertisements were starting to come out where he was starting to say that he was a former special investigator, he was making allusions that he worked for the FBI on these alien cases. And that's when the FBI actually got involved and started answering letters and such, to where it was like, no, he has never worked for the FBI. This is, but interestingly, in October of 1963, in Los Angeles, Frank E. Stranges, 43 years old, president of the International Evangelism Crusaders Incorporated, was convicted of operating a mail-order diploma mill that issued honorary Doctor of Divinity degrees for $25 each.
Ah.
And another key piece of evidence falls into place.
Yeah.
But he would, as of 1960, you would see articles in the paper of the Flying Saucer Mystery, a lecture with pictures, with Dr. Frank E. Stranges, former special investigator. See photos and slides of UFOs, many nations. What is the Air Force holding back? What did Central Intelligence admit? And learned of conversations with the man from planet Venus. As I mentioned, the FBI started making inquiries into Dr. Strange's in a bureau letter dated of October of 1960. They discussed Strange's lectures and his book Flying Saucerama, which is just a great title.
Oh man, that's such a punk album.
Inferring that his special investigator status was issued by the FBI, or that Frank was in fact a former FBI agent. In fact, the person who had made the complaint had attended several lectures, actually. And in reference to Valiant Thor, the FBI reported the following. She advised that in his lecture regarding flying saucers, he told of conducting an interview with a man from the planet Venus who had landed in a flying saucer near Washington, D.C., and who, according to Stranges, had been taken to the Pentagon and kept there for 3 years under guard by Army authorities. Stranges claimed that through his influence with the guards at the Pentagon, he was able to get to see this individual. When she advised that she had got the impression that he said that he had been conducting this interview at the request of the FBI, and that in obtaining information from the man from Venus, he was going to do it for the purpose of referring this information to the FBI. It goes on further to state, in reference to printed flyers and advertisements that had been volunteered, that he believed that the use of the phrase former special investigator might be misleading, and therefore intended to delete it from the newspaper ads that they were about to publish for Dr. Strange's. And this was one of the Seattle papers in 1960. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about My Friend from Beyond Earth, which was published in 1960. That was kind of the precursor to Stranger at the Pentagon. It can be found at Dr. Frank's lectures, and it's mentioned frequently in the FBI FOIA. And it includes in this file the interesting advertisement that says it's the first book of this nature ever written by a full gospel minister. A story you will have to read to believe, an account with a conversation with an interplanetary visitor. What did he look like, sound like, act like? Read what he said about Jesus Christ. Read what he stated about the future of Earth. See the photograph and many other UFO photos. Are we being visited by beings from other planets? Are angels walking amongst us? Are we facing doomsday or the new age? Will man leave this planet? I guess this would be a great time to pull some of the threads together. It's important to remember that, according to Harley Byrd and Frank Strange's, Val Thor came to Alexandria on 3/16. We mentioned that. there was a letter that was sent to J. Edgar Hoover in 1962 that says, "I have always believed and went along with all that Mr. Frank E. Strange's had to say, and I have felt that he is a real Christian. Now some things have been claiming him to be a fraud and untruthful. So I am writing to you to learn the truth about this man, and many will not believe that he was told to write this book about Valiant Thor, who he says was in the Pentagon for 3 years and talked to him. Val Thor is from another planet and was on our planet to help us in regards to our enemies," which is what you said as well. "Kindly let me know the truth of this, Mr. Hoover, and I thank you most sincerely." And my favorite part of this letter was, "Stamp enclosed for your reply."
I remember when you posted that on social media, man, I laughed so hard.
So after that, it says, "Your letter has been received. Although that I would like to be of service, the FBI, being an investigative agency of the federal government, neither makes evaluations nor draws conclusions as to the character or integrity of any organization, publication, or individual. I regret that I am unable to help you and hope that you will not infer in this connection that we do or do not have data in our files regarding to the subject of your inquiry. Sincerely yours, John Edgar Hoover, Director." And finally, my favorite part of that is, her stamp was utilized in the reply.
Oh, of course. That's beautiful. Oh, man. I love it. That's so funny that you would you would enclose a stamp to the federal government for one, and then that he used it. That is priceless.
Well, that was the big thing in the 80s, man. Send a self-addressed stamped envelope.
Oh yeah. But you wouldn't figure writing
That's
to
the government.
Yeah.
I agree.
They only run the post office. It's nothing. It's fine. That's awesome. Yeah, that letter really made my day whenever I read that. But I didn't know about the reply. That's great.
Oh yeah. I found the reply and it made my day.
It's like the most politically correct and polite way of saying piss off, and I smiled throughout your entire reading of it, ear to ear.
That was my favorite part. Her stamp was utilized in the reply.
That's terrific. What happens to Frank Strange's?
With Dr. Frank, he has a very long life. I mean, he passed away, I believe. I'm trying to remember exactly when it was, but you can go on the website rather of his organization. They no longer accept members, but they've got a beautiful write-up of his obituary and what he did and his legacy, and it's very nice.
So they no longer accept new members, but are they still an active organization?
I think they still sell the books.
Ah.
Take that as you must.
So there's just this one dude who's still using the name and selling.
Well, it's his daughter, I believe. Julia Strange's is carrying on his legacy.
That's interesting.
But yeah, you can go on the YouTubes, and they have a lot of his lectures and sermons. Even when he's talking about UFO stuff, he starts with having a fellowship at the beginning. I mean, it's very evangelical.
So what happens to Dr. Byrd?
Dr. Byrd is, from all intents and purposes, living in Los Angeles. As far as I know, I think after really that 1995, because that's when he was starting to ramp up on that diary. That's when the diary started coming out around 94, 95. He went on Art Bell and got absolutely trounced on Art Bell. And after that, I think he kind of went back into the quiet private world of Birdland. I'm not sure.
Of Birdland. Okay, so then the last piece of this is, what's the explanation for what happens with Valiant Thor, like when he leaves the U.S. government, leaves the Pentagon?
From what I remember of Val, he and this is kind of touched on in to bring it back to American Horror Story. If you haven't been watching it, I don't give reviews and such of many things, but what they are doing a really great job of is pulling a lot of the stuff that we're into and making a great fictional account of it. When you watch it, they bring up the Edwards Air Force Base meeting of Eisenhower. I mean, they bring up Valiant Thor. They bring up a lot of this. It's said that he dematerialized and departed from this phase of his earthly mission. His next stop was the outskirts of Alexandria, where his ship and his crew awaited his arrival, hidden by a wooded area. It was no problem for him to reassemble the atoms of his body inside his ship. As his craft rose slowly, a number of people stopped and pointed excitedly in his direction. Others stood motionless, transfixed by the sight which they beheld. He felt such a tremendous feeling of love for all of them. There was no panic in them, just curiosity and a strong desire to know more. Then, as the United States Air Force jets were scrambled, and with the force field now in full use, the planes darted past the ship, unable to see them now. Even ground radar lost them on their equipment. Confusion once again reigned. On the way back to Victor 1, he meditated on his home planet, the low, heavy, colorful clouds, the even temperatures, the perfectly diffused sunlight that made shadows almost non-existent, the lushness of the rich green grass surrounding his home. He was informed of several Earth people with whom he would maintain contact into the future.
So he just rides off into the sunset.
He rides off into the sunset. And I think this is what we should all take away from Mr. Thor's adventures on Earth. He wanted to mingle with and become as Earth people. He wanted to work and labor in Earth enterprises. He wanted to help those who encounter possible threat or danger while striving for world peace. He wanted to give them advice and guidance. He wanted to entrust with superior knowledge those who have proven themselves. And he wanted to divulge the essence of their mission to the collected national leaders of Earth only when the time was right. We salute you, Mr. Thor, yes, wherever you may be.
Indeed. Indeed. Man, I don't know. Now, knowing the things that you've brought to the patio on this episode, I don't put a lot of stock into Valiant Thor, I gotta say.
Well, I was afraid you was going to say that. We have to kind of go back to the original initial thing. I knew I was coming on the show. This was months ago.
Yeah.
It seems. And I was like, hey, I found this thing. I think it's going to be really cool. And I went down the rabbit hole. And the more I found, the crazier it got. And when I was finally finished and I put all my evidence together, and it gave me an overwhelming sense of meh.
Yeah. It's sad in a way because, I don't know, when you just know pieces of something and you let it build up in your imagination, whenever you're faced with the facts and the evidence that, is very pointedly contrary to the belief system that you had built up in your imagination, it's sad. It's just like you're driving home from work, you've had a really bad day, and you can't wait to get home and get that special homemade meatloaf, right? And instead, it's like bologna sandwich night, right? It's kind of like that.
Exactly. And your mouth is set on it, and you're like, this is not what I wanted.
Yeah. Bologna sandwiches with Valiant Thor. Welcome to the Paranormal Patio.
I love it. And I think we kind of need to put Val in that very special place with my most favorite of associates, the Inca.
Oh, yes, the Inca. What? You have some sort of follow-up from your appearance? Have you dug into that story? None
whatsoever. They lost me They lost me at the food pills, man. I was done.
Every vitamin and nutrient that you would need in an easily chewable capsule.
I think it's kind of like that scene in The Matrix where Cypher says, "The Matrix is telling me that this steak is juicy and delicious." And I say, ignorance is bliss.
Well, do we have anything else to wrap up with the strangeness of the Byrds and Doctor Strangeness and Valiant Thor? Have we covered everything that you thought you had wanted to bring up?
I think there is very little that we can add to this story. I would just say that when you're talking about the Venusians specifically, look at the parallels between George Adamski, who kind of really started it all. Mm-hmm. Look at Howard Minger's tales into it. Look at the Good Reverend's contributions to it. And realize that Gray Barker was sitting in his garage orchestrating all of this in my mind.
Yeah, I see it. I definitely see it. I've been operating with this sort of mindset that obviously, if these entities really did appear to these people, they were not from Venus, right? I mean, physically, it would be impossible. The temperature alone.
Well, that's the case right there. They advise that they live. Are you ready for it?
Go for it.
Underground.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I don't know, man. I have a hard time with that. I really do. I feel like it. Okay, so if these entities existed, they come here, they're communicating with people of Earth. Maybe it's, look, we can't tell you where we're from because you don't have the concepts of where we're from. And so we're going to tell you that we're from somewhere that's familiar to you. And we're going to tell you we're from Venus, which would be a name that you assign to a planet from your own planet. It's not like what we call it. We don't call it Venus. We call it Bongort or whatever. I think it's kind of like the non-physical elements of UFO abduction, where it's sort of these little comments and things that are interjected into the narrative to help us cope with and understand what we're going through when we're having these contactee situations.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And, not to bring up something that I was actually listening to other interviews that you had done. You actually were talking about your interview on Josh's program of your recipe theory.
Yeah. Oh, and please tell me you've got something to do with that.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, you were talking about specifically, frequency. I'm looking at frequency. I'm looking at time and place. I think everything, wherever it's coming from, whether it's the Akashic records, whether it's from the AM station, whether it's from Valiant Thor's Victor 1, I think that we're all vibrating at different frequencies. But once we get to that sweet spot, when we raise our vibration, that's when we start picking up the transmissions.
Yeah. Definitely a part of this thing that I'm cooking up, right? Like, I think there's more to it than just that. And I think maybe not. Maybe it is that, but the other things are what change the vibrational state. They're influencers of it.
You had also brought up a good point about, if it's not there, that we end up creating it as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at the Philip experiment.
Yeah.
That they did, even locally, where I'm at, there is a cemetery that for years, I mean, people were buried there. I have family that's buried there. Then up until about 10 years ago, these investigators started doing ghost hunts there and started reporting their findings. And 10 years later, it's gone from, hey, this place might have some ghost activity to, oh my God, dudes, there's witch graves, there's hellhounds, there is an 8-foot goat man with a burning red pentagram on his forehead. That goes back to, do we create these things? When we go looking and we don't find it, do we create what we're searching for?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's possible that we create it just to fill the void of what we're looking for, but it's also possible that it's kind of like clay, and we mold it, whatever it is, whatever this giant, seemingly intelligent energy is, we mold it to fit what we expect to find. So maybe it's not we're just making something out of nothing. Maybe there is something there, but we're molding it to be what we're capable of making it be at that moment. And I think that's kind of my driving point with this whole recipe theory.
I think you nailed it on the head. I mean, if you look at it as clay, what was the Jewish golem made out of? What did Yahweh make Adam from?
Yeah, I didn't even consider that whenever I said it. I was just trying to make a good comparison.
Yeah, it's an excellent comparison, because that's, in stories, that's literally how it was done.
That's very interesting. So now I have to start calling it the clay theory instead of the recipe theory.
I like them both. Just don't eat the clay, because
instructions confusing. I ate the clay.
They're like Japanese stereo instructions.
All right. Well, Matthew, I'm going to give you a few seconds, a few minutes, however long you want. You can take a few hours if necessary. Kind of let people know where they can find you online. Talk about House of Weird a little bit. And then when we finish up, I'm going to ask you a couple more things for Patreon exclusive content, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I don't have much to advertise and such. I do a couple of things. One of them is the Caretaker Project. With that, we believe that only by cooperation and changing the current culture of ghost hunting and internet paranormal groups can we debunk the urban legends and other incorrect information attributed to these areas that are negatively affecting our burial places in the Appalachian Mountains, including cemeteries, graveyards, mounds, and other sacred locations. If you would like to help us in our endeavors, you can reach us on Facebook at Caretaker Respect for the Dead, which is at facebook.com/Caretaker Project. You can always reach me on Twitter at Kobolos, Kobolos. And my little passion project is House of Weird, or House of Word, whichever you want to say. It originated as a place to collect the newspaper clippings that I'd gathered, including cryptids, UFOs, ghost tales, local murders, and strange stories around the area. We often do weekly themes, topics that lead to other topics. We started doing stories on the Tennessee Valley Authority and Oak Ridge's part in the Manhattan Project and how it influenced our area. And that actually brought us into multiple entries in Project Blue Book that we explored. We also did a week on local fairy folk legends, just whatever inspires us and is interesting as it pertains to our part of the Cumberland Plateau. And you can reach us there. We have a Facebook group free of charge at facebook.com/groups/House of Weird. That's WYRD. Or you can reach us on our blog at houseofweird.wordpress.com.
Wonderful. And if you're listening to this episode right now, those links will all be available for you in the show notes. So you don't even have to type. You can just click.
Thank goodness.
Drive in that traffic.
It reminds me of the old way of they go. It is HTTP
www
///.html.
Oh, yes. We've evolved.
I just remember having arguments with people. People were like, Jude, I was in your top 5, and now I'm not in your top 5, and I want to know what's going on.
Oh, we are just a ridiculous people.
We are. Absolutely.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much for having an actual appearance in the Paranormal Patio. And I know you did a patio takeover where we talked about the Inca, which we brought up earlier. So go check that out if you have enjoyed this episode. But yeah, thanks again for coming on. And I really, really had a great time.
Me too, Jason. Always a pleasure, sir.
The letter reply from...
Always remember, kids, if you want to reply, send a stamp.
Even if it's to the federal government.
Until next time, keep the fire going.